This presentation is on epistemology and education. First, we talk about knowledge and what counts as knowledge. This is an important question in philosophy, in all philosophy, as well as philosophy of education. In education, we don't often go back to ask this question because we carry in assumptions about what the knowledges are that we're supposed to be conveying. But it's worthwhile to back up and ask ourselves what is knowledge and what constitutes knowledge. And then we can ask ourselves, what are the knowledges that we feel are most valuable, and what are the knowledges that we should be passing along to others? So the first question is, what counts as knowledge? Noddings presents us a few different ideas about this. So knowledge could be something that corresponds to empirical reality. So what we would consider the material, physical presence in front of us. I'm seated at a table right now. I can feel it. When I grab onto it, if anyone else came into the room, they would agree with me that that's a table. So I believe it is. It is true, being verified, and I have some justification for my belief. So I can feel it, I can sense it, I can get someone to corroborate that. Knowledge could also be a subset of truth that has been acquired by a human investigator. So we think of truth here as something being broader than knowledge. Truth sometimes takes on this combination of knowledge and wisdom, or maybe if we think that knowledge has something to do with empirical reality, but truth is something broader than empirical reality. For example, um, beauty, love, compassion, divinity. These are things that are beyond empirical investigation that might fall under some people's definition of truth. Dewey, on the other hand, said that knowledge is bigger than truth. Statements that survive the test of inquiry may be called true. Instead of saying proving something, he would say we have a warranted assertability. We have some justification for saying something is true. But he said that there are many things that might be considered knowledge, but only the things that stick around, that survive our tests of inquiry, can be called true. So I might know that the world is filled with 7 billion people, and that happens to be true or close to true. If I was able to count all the people, then it would, and it did, in fact, all the people did add up to 7 billion. It's more than that now. That knowledge would then ascend to the category of truth. So this is different from the idea of truth being something larger. Dewey says knowledge is larger, and then all those things that can be verified can be called true. So depending on how we arrive at what it is that's knowledge, say we agree, or else we can't have any kind of educational endeavor, but we agree on what is knowledge. So then what does it mean to know something? If my job as an educator is to pass on knowledge, to evaluate knowledge in others, what does that mean? How do we know that somebody knows something? How do we establish that we know something? And here we have two different ideas of what knowing means. So this is from the German, and we get two different ideas: a clarin, which is an explanation, um, getting the right answer would be represented by this idea, and then verstehen, or understanding. It's an interpretive understanding. So these map on closely to the kinds of things, the kinds of ways that we know things through quantitative and qualitative research methods. So in quantitative methods, we want to know something empirically that maps onto our material reality, and we usually do that by verifying, by counting, by measuring in some way. So we want a causal explanation, and we want the right answer. We don't want just an approximate idea. Verstehen is in understanding. So to know something is to understand this, to understand why something comes about, why people are the way that they are, why they believe what they do is right, how an event took place, what all the repercussions are of any particular event. To see something from someone else's point of view, that's all understanding. So that's knowing something about someone. Those are two very different kinds of knowing. And like I said, in most cases, we talk about this when we're distinguishing our knowledge claims in quantitative or qualitative research. So, on what foundations might we rest our knowledge? Again, if you're thinking dichotomously, which you need not do, but if you think about doing quantitative research or traditional scientific research, your knowledge is going to rest on some kind of foundation. So we've got either rationalism or empiricism. So rationalism is based on logic. You see this in law. You see this in philosophy, in rhetoric, in any kind of persuasion. And then empiricism is what we use in the sciences. So confirmed by the senses, replicable, using the same design. So either you're arguing from logic or you're arguing from empiricism, which is the scientific method. Noddings talks about fallible foundationalism, meaning from Karl Popper, recognizing that you are working from some assumed foundation, but you're never going to be able to argue something completely, prove something completely. These are just approximations. So that's why we say it's fallible. This belief allows us to move from the assumption of positivism, right? There is one particular answer. We can get there through the sciences, to post-positivism, which represents this idea of fallible foundationalism. So we can get to some pretty good answers, some justified answers, and we apply post-positivism to the social sciences. So we understand that the search for absolute certainty is hopeless. We've given that up. And instead, we're going to use approximations, estimates, or probability theory to argue for a degree of certainty. So if you're using estimates, you're going to be using that in scientific applications, statistical tests, and probability is going to be used in making predictions, sometimes in logical arguments, and making persuasion in building models of prediction of events. Right? So these are big ideas. So we move from knowledge to truth, or from truth to knowledge, depending on your point of view. what is truth? What counts as truth? And I'm just asking about small t truth, indicating that from this perspective, there can be multiple answers. If we're talking about tall t truth and we come from an absolutist position, then we say there is just one large truth. And um, some people following a religious tradition might use this concept of tall T truth, true for everyone all the time, no matter what. Or more often we talk about small t truth are multiple truths, truths from certain perspectives. So one simple way to define this term, and maybe one of the dictionary definitions, would be the set of all true statements and beliefs. So, and again, when we talk about how do you define truth, and then you're going to use the word true in defining it, that's going to get you into problems. But here, truth is that simple idea of having of a statement that can be verified somehow. I'm sitting at a table. I can get someone to corroborate that. I can test that with my senses. So, what are the other ways that make a statement or a belief true? So, I'm giving you the example of the physical table that would fall under correspondence theory. So that corresponds with the facts, universally accepted at the local level. Absolutely no problem with that. Anyone would come in and tell me that. Someone who speaks a language other than English might have a different word for that thing that I'm sitting at. Um, so when we talk about truths in the moment, local truth, someone that can come in and verify my experience here, that's kind of easy. But when we talk about truth as something verified by the historical record, then we get into problems, because historical records are constructions. They're human beings retelling of events. We have digital footage now, going back to just about the turn of the century, the 18th to the 19th, or I'm sorry, the 19th to the 20th, early 1900s, sometimes late 1800s. You might have documentary footage, and you can say, well, there's proof the camera doesn't lie, but it does. There's splicing. There are effects that we can put into it. There, just your choice of what material to focus on can reconstruct rather than duplicate the event that's going on. So there's problems even with saying that um, relying on a historical record to say that something is true. And then there's coherence theory. So facts are sometimes revised to cohere with other accepted and verified facts or accepted beliefs. So historians, anthropologists, archaeologists, social scientists are using coherence theory all the time to revise what it is that they say that they know about something. So one of the latest that I've read about is the theory of how the dinosaurs went extinct. And for a long time, the prevailing theory was that there was a meteoric event that changed the climate and wiped them out. There's a woman right now who is using her own work to try to revise that theory. She says that it has more to do with a series of volcanic events on this planet, not the impact of meteors from outside of the planet. Mathematicians will use formulas, so consistency with axiom systems, so things that you just accept to be true. If so, A plus B equals C, that's something that you're going to accept to be true in order to work out further mathematical problems. So Those are two different ideas um, based on things that make sense together and things that we assume for the sake of convention. And it works just well. It works just fine for mathematics. And then when we apply mathematics to the movement of objects, for example, in engineering, that works for us as well. So does something have to work out in material reality for it to be true? Um, I don't know that, but it suffices, let's say. And so now there's non-foundational theories. So this idea that um, the absolute truth of a statement and beliefs can never be established. And so this goes back to this idea of falsifiability and postpositivism. And also falling under this would be Dewey, who we identify as a naturalist. So this has more to do with what is practical. We don't need a foundation to our truth. We reject the idea of absolute truth, but we use what is practical, whatever is effective toward a specific end. We understand here that truth is socially constructed, so agreed upon by a group of people, that if it works for them, or if at least it works for the most powerful people among them. And then conditioned by the knower based on their expertise, their ability, and their trustworthiness. So here's how something is true if some authority says that it is. We're having a bit of a problem now with suspicion of authority, suspicion of experts. People can always choose to not believe, but in a lot of realms of our human experience, and certainly true through history, if you had the Nobel laureate in economics tell you about a strategy for investment, you would say, yes, that makes sense. That's probably true. Um, but nowadays, it's just as common for someone to say, well, they are advancing some political agenda, so I'm going to follow the economic thinking that appeals to me or that the people that I like tend to believe in. So here, verification in use rather than justification through reason. So something is going to be verified because it works for me. So I'm following, again, a particular economic theory. It seems to map on to the reality of how the markets are operating. So for me, it's going to be true without needing to have a foundation there to say that this is something that is empirically or rationally has to be true. So the theories that we use in philosophy and social science, social theories in education would be considered non-foundational. So here's some common ones that we use here that provides us the philosophical frameworks for our research. Constructivism, probably the most popular, something that teachers use by and large. Falling under constructivism, would be Piaget's theory of genetic epistemology. So this inherent, inherited way of knowing. He theorized that there was some kind of mechanism of the mind, some kind of physical structure, combined with sensory experiences, combined to produce our reality. So we do construct our reality out of this structure in the brain, along with our physical senses. So that's where we get constructionism. We build our reality. Piaget also along with Vygotsky, observed that we do this with others. So sometimes it's called social constructivism, sometimes just constructivism, but still it's always understood that we, along with others, cooperate in constructing reality. Postmodernism here is a criticism of the modern, criticism of modern thinking, of you might hear it related to art, movement in art or literature. And so this is a criticism on the modernist period. It doesn't necessarily have to be something that comes after the modern period. We might still be in the modern period. You could say that we're in a postmodern period, but post actually means beyond the accepted understandings of the modern. So one of the, I guess, most general principles here is that there is no final truth. There is no final meaning. Meaning is always partial. There's no such thing as knowledge in general outside of context. So where the modern pursuit might be to find the answers for how to solve social problems, how to understand, predict, and control the natural world in science, how to create the most aesthetically pleasing work of art. Postmodernism says there's no reason to pursue that because there is no such thing as the best or the most appropriate or the way to do something. There are multiple ways, and even meaning, the way that we understand something, what it means to us personally, that's always going to be partial. It's going to be conditioned by our prior experiences, who we are at the particular time, where we are in our lives. That's a general sense of postmodernism, which could take a whole day to talk about on its own. But so just fitting that into a discussion of ways of knowing, epistemology, ways of knowing. Next and related here is feminism or any other standpoint epistemology. And what a standpoint epistemology is a way of knowing that's based on your usually social, material, political, embodied experience. So feminism is a kind of standpoint epistemology based on the ways of knowing of women or of what we associate with the feminine. And that's going to be different depending on which culture you're coming from. So these standpoint epistemologies privilege the lived experience of the knower, members of an oppressed group, over objective knowledge of the dominant class. So in any society, you're going to find that official knowledge is that thing valued by, perhaps constructed by, the dominant classes. And the standpoint epistemologies are going to privilege, meaning select and elevate the standpoint of members of the oppressed group, especially when it comes to knowledge that has to do with them. So, for an example, if you're talking about the a dominant political group, okay, the political party that's in power, they're the ones that are going to set the official knowledge about the economy, about foreign policy, about domestic policy. But when they're talking about a certain subgroup of people, let's talk about recent immigrants, then the standpoint that would be elevated would be that comes from the people who are themselves recent immigrants. So, it's a recognition that people who are living, the experience, who are members of a particular class, have specific knowledges about their own experience and about their own group that the dominant classes just can't have access to. And phrased that way, I think it's more common sense than what some people might make it out to be. So you can have Patricia Hill Collins writes about Black feminist standpoint epistemology. So she goes over even further to say that Black women should be privileged. Their knowledge, their perspective, their understandings about being a Black woman should have privilege over what other women say, and certainly what men have to say about that experience. So these, if you can't tell, these standpoint epistemologies are always going to be supportive of justice or some other kind of social value. They're anti-oppressive. They are, by specifically taking the perspective of the oppressed group, they are making a stance for trying to advance a more equitable condition. So when we're talking about epistemology or ways of knowing, we sort out first our theory of knowledge. Now we want to talk about what gets to count as knowledge. So in any society, what gets to count as knowledge is determined by those in power. And in freer societies, you have access to knowledge from subgroups or subordinated groups. So in the United States, we have in our history textbook, mainstream history, and it's written from the perspective of the first wave of British immigrants who were colonists, British colonists, and then the creation of the United States from the perspective of those original colonists. And then we also have access to histories and knowledges from other perspectives as well. But in any society, what counts as knowledge, as mainstream knowledge, is always going to be determined by those in power. We identify this ability to decide what gets to count as knowledge as cultural capital. And it complicates the observation that knowledge is power. So we hear this from Michel Foucault, and what he meant is that the people that get to decide which knowledge is gets to count, what counts as knowledge, actually wield this ideological power over the rest of society. So they get to set the parameters of what is high culture. They get to set the parameters for what it means to be an educated person. They get to set the parameters for what it means to be qualified to rule. Sometimes educators will tell students that they should learn as much as they can because knowledge is power. And by this, they mean that the more you know, the more options that you'll have in life for choosing the kind of career that you want. We are a meritocracy in that we reward people based on their achievements. It's not perfect in that we look at systemic injustices where people who achieve the same thing still don't seem to receive the same treatment. But in general, that's how you advance along in the society. And more specifically, we're a credential society. So we look at education as a means toward earning a credential that then qualifies you for specific jobs, specific honors, specific titles, qualifies you to adopt licenses that authorize you to practice law, medicine, and teaching. So there are three basic epistemological positions, and this is where, again, philosophy influences research. Those three are objectivism, constructivism, and subjectivism. And I think in the next slide I have a chart to give you a little bit more information about that. So if you're coming from the perspective of being the researcher who is unbiased, absolute blank slate, and you're looking for meaning out there in the object of your study. So I'm approaching some phenomenon to study it, and all of the meaning to be found in that object is in the object. It's not coming from me. That's the assumption of objectivism. Constructivism is bolded because it is most often the epistemological position adopted by educators and actually all social scientists. But it's understood. It's not something that you'll see called out too often unless you're reading someone's graduate research project or thesis or dissertation, in which they might be required to call out their epistemological position. So here the assumption is that the subject and the object, or the researcher and their human participant, or the researcher and their text, the researcher and their artwork, are co-constructing meaning together. And so what this means is that the meaning that's found in the object of study isn't just entirely contained in the object, it's also partially constructed by the interpretation of the researcher, and that is going to be conditioned on the context of the researcher, her or his experiences, the language that they speak, beliefs, education, where they happen to be in their life. So there's this idea that there are two paths of meaning, where meaning is coming from. And then there is subjectivism. And this is rare, but you might find this in the humanities or in philosophy, where the idea is that there is no meaning out there in the world. All of the meaning to be found is created from the researcher. This takes the idea of interpretation to the extreme, to say that there absolutely is no meaning in any phenomenon apart from the interpretation of the observer. You don't, like I said, you don't see that a lot, but it does come up sometimes in the interpretation of texts or in some philosophical positions. And here's my chart. You can admire my hand drawing here, and maybe this makes it easier for you to see that if we call the subject the researcher and the object is really the object of study, you can see here in the position of objectivism, the blank slate. The subject is carrying no meaning and finds all the meaning in the object. Here in constructivism, the most common, the researcher and the object of study are co-constructing meaning together. And in subjectivism, here the subject is bringing all the meaning, and here the object is the blank slate. So I hope that helps you with some of the terms in this chapter about epistemology. Here, if you take a look at where objectivism, constructivism, and subjectivism fall into a chart on ontology, epistemology, and theoretical perspectives. So I get this mostly from Michael Crotty, and he helps us to think through the foundation, the philosophical foundations of research. you can see how objectivism maps onto this idea of one reality, and it pairs very well with theoretical perspectives that support quantitative traditional scientific research. So, functionalism, that's a social scientific idea that society is working kind of like a human being, an animal, or a machine where every part is working together. When there is a dysfunction, it's because some part has broken down. When that part is fixed, the whole system will work very well again. You can also carry objectivism into your social science project, sticking with post-positivism here, which is just that one step away from positivism, saying that I'm going to search for meaning out there, and we can approximate it, but I'm going to put that post in front of my positivism to acknowledge that I know that an absolute final answer can't be found. Likewise, you can see where constructivism maps on nicely to a multiple nature of reality and is the foundation for these more common theoretical perspectives that you find in social science work, especially education. Now, sometimes you'll see constructionism and constructivism used interchangeably. Michael Crotty calls the epistemological position constructionism, and then the theoretical perspective constructivism. So, like Piaget or Vygotsky's theories. But the critical theories also fall under here and adopt a constructionist epistemology. Conflict theory, you can think of that as Marxist. Critical emancipatory theories, you can think of Freire here. Transformative pedagogies. Later, when we take a look at mindfulness, you might take a look at some of those. You could call Freire transformative as well. And then finally, we have subjectivism, and like I said, it's kind of rare, and here it maps onto this hyper-individualistic reality. Reality is only happening to me. We all live in our own separate realities, um, and it's only by consensus, it's only for convention's sake that we agree upon where our own individual realities intersect, and that's what we call our common reality. So, certain kinds of radical interpretivism, post-structuralism, these are theories useful for um, French philosophy, literature, literary philosophy like Sartre, postmodernism, post-critiques, and transformative work on the self. So here I distinguish transformative pedagogies about society, such as Freirean and transformative theories about changing the self, and that's more Michel Foucault. Noddings doesn't get into Michel Foucault. I provide a little bit of Foucault for you, and I can certainly direct you to more if that's something that is interesting to you.